Hello and welcome to day 2 of our 2020 Inland Northwest State of Reform Virtual Health Policy Conference. I appreciate you being here with me. I know we had a pretty cool day yesterday, a lot of engagement from different folks from DC up and down the West Coast, and of course, particularly here in Washington State. And we're all trying to figure out this new COVID space, of course, the trials of distance learning with our kids at home and wearing sweats every day into the home office. But one of the things that we get to do is we get to be uniquely connected with people that, now that we're all using video conferencing and virtual conferences like this, we get to connect with folks that we may not have normally had opportunity or been willing to connect with face-to-face, meaning I certainly didn't use Zoom for my standard phone calls and my standard engagement as I do now. I wasn't doing that 6 months ago. And one of the things that we can do today that we would not have done at last year's event here, for instance, is we're able to bring in international voices and international perspectives. We can do that in this virtual setting in a way that we just would not have been able to do in person. And of course, we're still very hyper-local in terms of our focus with our 75 speakers. The vast majority of those are engaged with Washington State healthcare and health policy. But we thought it would be interesting and useful and really unique to have a panel of folks from across the globe who could offer their insights and really just their lived experience about this COVID pandemic from a lot of different perspectives. We thought that this might be an opportunity, and it will be, I think, a chance to lift our eyes up out of the sort of hullabaloo of the day-to-day in this general election cycle and the challenge of going back to school and the challenge of dealing with COVID. A chance to lift our eyes up to see how the rest of the world or parts of the world are engaging with this, and to remind ourselves that we are a bigger community than just the one in which we live. So with that, I want to bring in 3 guests who are friends, and really I appreciate each of you for making time to join us on your personal time, because you're 8 hours ahead and 9 hours ahead and 10 hours ahead of us here on the Pacific Standard Time. So first, not my cousin, but with my same surname, Katherine Wilson, author and cultural commentator living in Rome. Thank you, Katherine, for being with us. Ross Ciesla, the Chief Investment Officer of Veritas Management. I appreciate you being with us, Ross, and Mohamed Abdirizak, who was the past presidential candidate for the nation of Somalia. He now is the founder of FDG-Synergy based out of Nairobi. Sir, appreciate you making it as well. So let's just jump in. Katherine, you early on, because of Italy being on the front edge of the curve here and experiencing this pandemic early on, you wrote a piece that got some international pickup, helping parents to think about what they were about to go through. One of the things you said and wrote, and which we employed, was not to worry about screen time, to let your kids sort of make their way through this experience. Let me ask you, just first as a parent, now that you're 6 months in, how are things going with you and your kids and your family?
Well, it's a bit of a roller coaster, as I think it is for all parents. At the beginning, when I wrote the article, I felt like Italy was about 2 to 3 weeks ahead of the US in terms of we had been hit very hard, the hardest of any country in the West. And we have teenagers who, of course, were saying, well, all my friends are going out and, there's a party here, and why can't I do this? And why can't I do that? And there was still the idea that this was a disease that affected primarily older people. And so we let them out and let them do whatever they wanted to do. And I saw the US coming up to that point. And so when I wrote the article, I felt the need to tell American parents, this is what we went through too. So, you can't worry about what everybody else is saying. You've got to just look at the science and look at what people are advised, the experts are advising, and make your choices based on that. Now that after the lockdown, things got much easier in Italy, we sort of came back to, again, the same situation as before, because as you know, as parents, you then it's not like they accept something and say, okay, well, we give up. They started saying, well, wait a second, there are almost 0 cases. So now we can go back and do exactly what we were doing 6 months ago. And so it's always a constant negotiation. And the same thing with school. Day by day, we have to see the schools are open here in Italy, but it's, as they say, a new normal. So there are masks and there's distancing. And it's a challenge for parents, but I always tell my kids it's a real challenge for the teachers too. I mean, they haven't lived this before. So I think everybody has to have empathy for and understanding and compassion, because we're figuring it out day by day.
Ross, we're going to talk about how COVID has impacted some of the global economy here in a minute. But again, as a parent, how are you navigating this, and how have you found the support for families in London as you all have navigated this pandemic?
Thanks, DJ, and thanks for asking me on. Like Catherine, I think back to one of the most common phrases in our house, I think a year ago, was get off the iPad, get off the Xbox, you've got too much time on that. But it's actually tech, when you've had kids trapped in the house, and I have a 9 and 11-year-old, it's actually been really important for social contact. It's been their play date time. So we've had the initial lockdown period from, I think, about March through to May, June time, and now we're back in it with some trade-offs. Kids are back at school, but it's been tough, and I think it's been tough for politicians as well, because you can't really be trained for this. I was in London yesterday, so I go to the office about once a week. I commute, and I look around London, and it's pretty deserted. Our office is near Covent Garden, which is right in the centre, and there's a lot of shops now being boarded up. So I think the next 6 months, which is what's just been announced, we're going to be on a higher level of lockdown. I think people are really feeling it, parents, employers, politicians. So it's I think people are keeping their fingers crossed for light at the end of the tunnel.
So in Europe, you guys, based on my reading, you are sort of at the front end, maybe, of another kind of tightening, right? I mean, it looks like in Europe, at least in places like France and Spain, things are starting to get a little bit dicier. Ross, is that what it looks like from where you sit?
It feels that way. It feels like where we were maybe in February, where you look at some countries in Europe and they were a bit ahead of the UK. And the news flow in the UK in the last few weeks has been charting the rising cases in France, for instance. I think Spain as well. And I think we track about a week and a half behind that. So it feels like slightly like a replay. The one positive side to it is, I think that whilst cases are going up, it does seem so far that the amount of deaths isn't really ticking that much higher. But I don't know whether that's because we've not had the full wave and it's hit hospitals yet. So people are really, really quite cautious, I think, on the next 2 weeks. I think it'll be interesting to see how that pans out.
Yeah. Mohamed, tell us about what it's like in Kenya. You're based in Nairobi, of course. You're out at a beachside village now. That's not a fake background behind you. That's your real setup. Tell us what it has been like this last sort of 6 months from where you sit.
Thank you, DJ. When back in March, the Kenyan government was very proactive and immediately issued a series of restrictions and policies to from curfews at night to, offices were all shut down, instituted masks to be worn in public. And so for the better part of the first 2-3 months, we have gone through the shock of not knowing what this is all about. And the Kenyan population pretty much really complied with all that was going on. Schools, of course, shut down. International travel stopped completely. Airports closed. My work is in Somalia, a neighboring country, and it took me 6 months before I could first travel there. So that first 6 months, it was all about working from home. Of course, as humans, we adjust a little bit to once we know what is happening to a little bit better. but pretty much in Kenya, people practiced social distancing, wearing masks. You cannot go to any store without your temperature being taken and being issued with hand sanitizers. Restaurants were closed for the first 5 months. Bars are still closed to this date. And there's a little bit of relaxation. International travel is open, and now we're lucky to be able to travel to the coast regions, flights and everything. There's completely new procedures for everything. So that is how Kenya is.
And you mentioned that you now can travel a little bit. You told me a story about how Somalia is a little different than Kenya. Why don't you walk us through that experience of getting back to Somalia and what it was like there versus in Nairobi?
Yes, absolutely. And for those 6 months, we really got used to living in this procedural sort of wearing the masks, gloves if necessary, sometimes hand sanitizers all the time, distances. I traveled to Somalia for the first time in August, and once I got there, the driver who picked me up from the airport was wearing a mask. But once I got to the hotel, I did not see anyone else wearing a mask. Public gatherings and everything is as though it was pre-COVID. And when I asked people what's happening here, well, they said, half the population basically lost their sense of smell and the other half lost their sense of taste. Some people died and things are normal. And so I couldn't really be the only one wearing masks or anything. It was just impractical for me to protect everybody else and for me not to be protected because, as you know, masks are, the intent is to protect the other person. And for 3 weeks, I just lived normally, handshakes, everything, as though COVID has never really come to this part of the world. And when I was leaving, as is the procedure, you have to take tests because Kenyan government will require that you send in your results before you arrive in Kenya, and that you can be tracked for the next 14 days by sending in telephone messages about your temperature, whether you had symptoms and so forth. And so I had to do that. And I was just wondering, how different two countries that are neighboring in this part of the world have, put policies and procedures in place. And while we would never know exactly the death tolls exactly in Somalia or in Kenya, we do generally believe that death toll in Africa has largely been much smaller, or the rate of infection much smaller than in Europe and in America. That I don't know how to explain, but I see Ross is raising his hand.
I just think that's really interesting because I know that in London, there's some areas that are really, really, really quiet. But then I was speaking to a colleague this morning because we're all working remotely, and she said that there's some areas it's just absolutely normal time. Saturday's like a normal Saturday, and people will wear masks on public transport, but there are very, very few people wearing masks on the street. I would say, less than 10% of people walk through the streets with a mask on in London.
Wow. Less than 10% of people wear a mask in London?
In public transport, you're mandated, as soon as you walk into Waterloo railway station, for instance, there is a sign saying you must wear a mask. And if you don't, you get fined. I don't know the amount. And obviously you have to wear it on the train, and you're expected to socially distance on the train. So you have to spread out. So if you're on a two-seater, there's only one person can sit there. And frankly, the trains are really quiet anyway. As soon as you come out of the train station, people take off their mask.
Yeah, wow. In the United States.
Can I just jump on that as well? It's not
Sure.
really only about governments and what policies they institute. It's also the people and how they react to those or accept or do not accept those. So there is different culture everywhere in the world. While in Kenya, people largely complied with the policies that were instituted. In Somalia, they rejected that. So it wasn't lack of government instructions or policies to do something about this, but having a weak government that is just being reconstituted, and the public just have rejected. And I think that you can see elsewhere.
Yeah. Mohamed, you know, of course, that as the sun starts to go down there behind you out on the African coast, we'll need more light on your face. I know you've already flagged that, so just keep an eye on it. Katherine, I want to ask you, because you grew up in America, and you know that there's a significant portion of the community that is anti-science. Linda Reeder, one of our attendees, asks about whether there is a comparable level of anti-science or anti-vax movement or anti-mask movement, as Ross was alluding to, and how are different European countries, and particularly in Italy where you live, how are you seeing the conversations around science in particular, but also masks and vaccines?
Well, I think that there are conspiracy theories, there are anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers, anti-science, but it's much, much smaller than it is, at least, for example, in the United States. And I think a lot of that is also because in terms of the media and the communication, Italy is still, and I think the European countries in general, are still countries where there is an evening news. I mean, there is one basic venue of communication. For example, during lockdown, all of Italy would watch the 6 o'clock Protezione Civile, where the scientists would give the information, the data was given. And whereas I feel like in the United States, in a way, being ahead, technologically ahead, people are able to find their own news sources because so much of it is via social media or via other. So I feel like there's really a sense in Italy that that the science that comes out and the government, which was quite honestly pretty unified and clear in their message, Italians are behind it. I mean, there are a few voices contrary, but they get drowned out pretty quickly.
So in Italy, there's a North and South divide that's longstanding. There's national unity versus regional tensions. Do you see, and to parenthetically say, in the United States, as you know, there's a different view about this pandemic based on whether you are in a red state or a blue state, whether you tend to vote Republican or tend to vote Democratic. Are you seeing any of those kind of regional or partisan divides appearing in Italy? Or to your point you just made, is it really pretty monolithic because of the communication channels?
I think it's so unbelievable to me, having lived in Italy for over 20 years and hearing always complaints about whoever's in power. So it's always politicized and these people don't know what they're doing. And then as soon as COVID happened and we saw those tanks with the caskets, it was like all of that just shut down. And we listened to Conte, we listened to the prime minister. And he also was I thought, very good at not only making it not about him, but not responding to any sort of provocation from other political parties. He made it about the issue and about COVID. And so it was fascinating to me because all of a sudden, Italy is, all Italians do, it seems to me, is complain about how the politicians are doing things wrong. And then all of a sudden, in this case of emergency, it was health. And it was like, okay, guys, this is serious. We're not gonna talk about that. So I think Italy was both penalized, but also in some ways helped by the fact that it was hit so hard so early, because I think that made a real necessity of choosing a unified national policy. And I think also the fact that it hit the North first made a big difference, because as my friends from the South said, if this had happened in Puglia and that many people had died in Puglia or in Napoli or in Sicily, we're not sure that the same thing would have happened. But what everybody realized was, if this happened in the richest, most efficient part of the country, we've got to all take this really seriously.
Yeah. Wow. Ross, let me ask you about that sort of partisan divide. I think the politics of the United Kingdom were a little closer in terms of polarization related to Boris Johnson and the polarization related to Donald Trump in the United States. Boris Johnson obviously got COVID himself. Is there sort of a polarization amongst the Labour and SNP and Conservatives? And did the Boris Johnson, the fact that he got infected, did that change any of the politics or how the community has been responding in the UK?
Yeah, good question. I think there's a couple of things I would say is, I think at the start, people had sympathy for these politicians having to deal with it. And Boris Johnson would be on TV regularly with scientists. And then what happened was he was seen to be publicly shaking hands with people and ended up getting COVID. So going against his advice, and he ended up in hospital and he almost died. But what happened also was his key advisor, a guy called Dominic Cummings, who's quite a divisive figure in the UK. He was the main guy behind Brexit campaign. He left London, I think for reasonably understandable reasons, during lockdown to his parents. But whilst he was at his parents, he was spotted. He traveled to a castle, a tourist base. And he was asked, why did you do that? You were meant to be under lockdown. The government guidance was, no unnecessary journeys. And he said, well, I left to go for a half-an-hour car journey because I thought my eyesight was being impacted by COVID. And I thought if I drove, that would be a good test of my eyesight because I wanted to get back down to London. And it really smacked of, rules for some, rules for others. And, he's still in his post today. So I think you went from this initial mood of we're all in this together. Let's listen to the scientists who are flanked by politicians saying, we're going to give you all the data. And then the mood quickly changed to, oh, wait a minute. What about accountability, responsibility here if we are all in this together? I don't think we've had any division in relation to vaccinations, the mask thing, being you have to wear it on public transport and in shops, I should add, but it's the streets that people don't have it. There's been a bit of confusion on that, but I don't think it's divided along partisan lines.
Yeah. Mohamed, Ranjan Shakya has a question for you specifically, but I'll ask everybody a derivation of it. He wants to know about how the educational system and the health services system has been impacted in Kenya and other African countries, particularly in the rural communities. How are rural communities responding as a result of COVID, not just to COVID, but because of just the shock to the overall system? How are rural communities responding in Africa?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to the whole of the continent, but just in Kenya in general, the lockdowns came, and the government was issuing specific, news bulletins about COVID and reporting on new infection and where these are happening. And Nairobi, which is the capital and the most populous, as well as Mombasa, the coastal town, these were the counties that had the highest rates of infection. And government has made some provisions for this. As I said earlier, schools were all shut down, and students had to, we're lucky enough to because of my work, to have kids going to international schools, but not every kid in Kenya and or in Somalia would be able to do online, attending classes online and all of that. So, but schools were closed and just reopening with certain precautions, procedures, social distancing and all of that. The initial shock and the fears that we had about hospitals not having the capacity to deal with and absorb all the cases has not happened. Upcountry, because of the lockdowns, people were not allowed to go to these parts of the country, mainly because in Kenya, a lot of people have their villages, and a lot of the elderly and the parents are still at the village in, outside of the country. And the younger people, the working populations are in the city, who then on the weekends and holidays go. And this was completely shut down. And so no alarming cases, no higher numbers, and hospitals at the end were somehow able to cope with the low infection rates that we've had in Kenya.
And in each of your communities, it sounds like you've had relatively good adherence to some of these policies. Particularly, it sounds like in Nairobi, and then maybe Italy next, and then the UK after that, particularly on the street wearing comment you made, Ross. How do you sort of place your communities vis-a-vis other communities? And I'm specifically asking about America and how you sort of view Kenya's performance or Italy's performance or the UK's performance vis-a-vis what you see in your mainstream media about the performance in a place like America or the performance in a place like China or Taiwan or Russia. Do you feel like your countries are kind of leading the pack, or do you think that, does it give you, sort of make you pessimistic about your community? Katherine, let me ask you that first. How do you think Italy compares to other countries and the United States in particular?
Well, I think that this is a time when priorities come to the fore. So I think that Italy will always prioritize health and will always prioritize the weakest members of society. And it's easy to then think, oh, well, the United States maybe has not fared as well because it's given the priority to economics, or it's given priority. But before I say that, I really do believe that at this point there are two Americas. And that's what I tell Italian friends when they say, but Americans believe this. And the more I read and the more I see the news, I think it's impossible to talk about America per se. I think if there was a different administration in the White House, I would not be able to say the same thing.
Yeah. Mohamed, let me ask you to build off that. Americans, as you know, sometimes we think we're the center of the world, and sometimes we don't always lift our eyes to our neighbors and the other experiences. How important is America's performance during COVID to other countries? And how important is the American election on November 3rd to other countries, at least in your opinion?
DJ, first of all, as someone who has lived, half of his life in America, and who still have family and friends, and basically everyone in my family is still in America, we watch with horror, what we have been seeing initially in New York, and then as it spread to other states. I do have friends who were affected by this. I have relatives, parents who are dealing with COVID. But then living here, where we don't have as much deaths, we are just really scratching our heads. Maybe there are different strains of this COVID. Maybe there are other reasons to explain what is exactly going on. We don't know. I'm not a health, expert, but I personally feel the way the Kenyan government has acted early on in shutting down and doing all the, those policies and procedures and the, harsh, which were seen as harsh initially, I think we're grateful for. We're happy about how the public really followed these instructions. And I don't feel in America that was the case. And yes, we live far apart, but I'm an American citizen and I've made all the provisions to vote in this November as well.
Yeah. Mohamed, I got to say, I appreciate that you have kind of jury-rigged yourself a setup where you can participate with us here out in in the village that you're visiting out on the coast, where you've got you started, for folks that have just joined us in progress. Mohamed started with the beautiful sort of background and the pool and all that stuff, and then sun has set where he is, and he's kind of making it happen for us. So I appreciate it. Ross, let me ask you, what do you think when you think in terms of the global economy, and particularly the Western economy of the United States and Europe? What do you make of the shock of COVID to the United States and the market here? And what do you make of the November 3rd general election? Is one more transformational than the other? Are these short-term shocks that the global economy will weather regardless of who wins on November 3rd, for instance? Or are these more important decision points that we have experienced in 2020?
So on the shocks, when we started heading into this, say in March, around about that time, February, March time, the one thing that we felt was, in every downturn, there's always a response. There always is. In the GFC, the global financial crisis, there was a huge response. Our view was this is a willful stopping of the economy, because lockdown was a known event. Normally, when you go into recession, you're not quite sure how severe it's going to be or whether you're going into a recession. So the authorities always have a sort of economic fog in front of them. This was different, because when you started shutting down cities, and you could track that on Google traffic sites, you knew this was going to be a hard economic stop. So the policy response, because we know this is a hard economic stop, has been huge. Outstrips the GFC response by country by magnitudes. So you've had a huge economic stimulus package kicking in, and it's been global because this is a global event, and it's been quick. Because if you remember the stimulus in the global financial crisis, there was a bit of a battle over that because you were bailing out the bankers. That was the narrative. This is different because COVID is in the streets. So this is why the markets have rallied. You've had the huge amounts of stimulus, which of course is more debt. So is that, a drag on future economic growth? We've already had a demographic and debt build up anyway that should drag economic growth. But the stimulus in the short term is huge, and the hope is that economic growth will carry us through that. Now, I actually don't think the politicians had any choice. They had to put huge stimulus. As for November the 3rd, I think everybody that looks at the States, I get excited about the States bottom up, because you've got some of the best technology companies in the world. I saw Walmart, I think today I noticed on LinkedIn, Walmart saying they're going to be carbon neutral by 2040. And I think Microsoft have also said they'll be carbon neutral, I think, by 2030. They had a water announcement recently about replenishing water by 2030, so they won't be net using water. And I look at the States bottom up and I think, wow, it's still a great country. My wife's from Detroit, by the way, so I have to watch what I'm saying anyway. But politically, I just think it's an aberration. No one can quite believe, at a time when you really need leadership, what is happening. It seems a country that you've got some of the best innovators in the world, and the best thinkers and the best debates, that you've got a real problem at the top. So bottom up, I actually feel quite optimistic. And I think this will motivate people to make a lot of changes on the environment and so on. But top down, I think November the 3rd will be the most important election I've seen in my lifetime. And I know my parents think that as well. It's probably the world's most important election in decades.
And you're saying this based obviously in London, and you think the American election is more important than some of the UK elections like Brexit?
I think it is actually, yeah. Yeah, I mean, Brexit is obviously unique to us, but I think the difference is where the world goes in the next decade, when we've got so many challenges: inequality, climate change, healthcare. And, everybody listening to this will be, very well informed of the healthcare sector and the changes, I think, that need to be made. I know everywhere the healthcare systems have been showing in some way to be perhaps out of date. One of the companies we invest in, the CEO said to us that the healthcare infrastructure in the States, and I think this applies to other countries, is roughly where financial infrastructure was 30 years ago. And there's been an incumbency at about an infrastructure where there's been a lack of change. I just wonder what will force the necessary changes to take place. More of the same, or do we get a change? And it feels like November the 3rd is important globally for tackling a lot of global problems, pandemics, climate change, and so on. Trade deals as well.
So one topic, Katherine, that is a thread between the pandemic and the economic recovery and how it shapes our politics and how it is shaped by our politics is this question of a vaccine. And Sam Hatzenbeller asks about how countries are preparing for distribution and administration of vaccines. And again, I know you're not necessarily in those conversations on behalf of the Italian government, but what are the kinds of conversations that are taking place amongst friends and colleagues about how quickly you're going to want to race out and get a vaccine, about how those should be distributed? And you know, of course, in the United States, there will be a cost of some sort for individuals. Is that anticipated to be free in the Italian healthcare system? What do you think?
Yes, I mean, in general, it's kind of a given that it would be free. They haven't given any timelines. I think as opposed to other countries where people want the reassurance of it'll be here by. In Italy, they haven't said anything specific, but I think it's a given that it would be free, and that first it would be given obviously to the people, to the healthcare workers and people that have the greatest need for it. I have a friend who works for the company that does the Oxford Pomezia, and she had an appointment to get the vaccine in September, but then there was in the UK there was an anomaly, and so that was halted. But she was going to get it. She was an employee of the company, and she was going to get it. Her husband, her child, and her babysitter. So the nuclear family was all signed up for it. Then they didn't come out with exactly what the anomaly was in one of the volunteers. So that was put on hold. But there is talk and some optimism of it. But for now, nobody's giving any specific timing. They're just saying, get your regular flu vaccine. And that's obviously done free through the public healthcare system here. And as well, you know, the nasal swabs. My son at his school, every 10 days, they get the nasal swab, and it's not obligatory, but they offer it to us for, I think it's 20 euros. So again, parents who can afford that do it, parents who can't, it's not obligatory, but it's something that's helpful in the community, you know, because it at least maybe we'll get the numbers down a bit. But if you have obviously any symptoms, but also, for example, we went to Croatia this summer, and when we came back, we all got swabs and results within 12 hours. And obviously that's all without cost.
How long does it take for those results to come back, Katherine, for your children's tests?
10 minutes. So it's immediate. It's immediate. Yeah, there's some talk about how reliable they are, obviously, but my feeling is even if they're not 100%, we're talking about numbers here. So we're talking about even if it finds that one, it's going to help us.
We've got just a minute or two really left. So just briefly, let me ask you, Ross, to start. What gives you hope in this crazy time in our world, in our economy, and in this public health crisis? I'll ask each of you this question, but Ross, will start with you. What gives you hope right now?
I think what gives me hope is the fact that everybody's in this together. All countries are in this. And we've had a lot of warnings about something like this happening. I mean, the Bill Gates TED Talk has been viral for some time now. And I've got hope because I think people will realize that we really need to start listening to experts again. We really need to start listening to scientists, and we need to plan ahead. These things that we're warned about are on the horizon now. Yeah. So I think this might actually galvanize a movement, and you can see it beginning. that we'll actually get proper change on key issues that unite us all.
Mohamed, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is the fact that I know people are working hard at coming up with vaccines. And I hope that in healthcare and pandemics and diseases, it is not a situation where you can have the populations vaccinated and other half, and not to be vaccinated, so not to be able to afford, and therefore you are all okay. So hopefully leadership that will recognize the importance of sharing that vaccine and healthcare, even in Africa, so that global economies can reopen and people can travel again. And that is what I'm hoping for and how close we are to it.
Colleen Pacheco says, thank you for getting your vote in, Mohamed. Appreciate you doing that. Katherine, last word, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope, I also put my ballot in for the Maryland State Board of Elections, so I'm hopeful for that. Good. But I think, yes, as Ross and Mohamed said, I think, first of all, COVID has come with it an urgency. I mean, these were all issues that we knew: inequality, climate change, the interconnectedness. We all knew that it existed, but without the urgency of this kind of emergency, it never would have come to the forefront. So I think the fact that we're all connected, and I think also as a parent, I'm hopeful that this experience will teach the next generation that this rush towards individual success, individual happiness, individual realization is actually not what it's all about. And I think that's the most important lesson that COVID could teach.
And Katherine, tell us the name of your book, what it's about, and where folks can find it in about 20 seconds.
Okay, it's called The Mother-in-Law Cure, and it was out by Penguin Random House, and it's about my experience in Italy, learning from my Italian mother-in-law, lessons of life.
Awesome, great stuff, and available at Amazon. Katherine Wilson, author and cultural commentator, I appreciate you being with us. Ross Ciesla, Chief Investment Officer at Veritas Investment Management, and Mohamed Abdirizak, founder of FDG-Synergy and former presidential candidate in Somalia. Really appreciate you guys doing this. Not everybody, of course, in our audience knows that you signed up for this about 4 days ago, but this was really strong and fabulous. Thanks for doing this.